Timeline of Mount Everest expeditions.
Mount Everest is the world's highest mountain, with a peak of 8,849 meters, 29,031.7 feet, above sea level. It is situated in the Himalayan range of Salakhumbu district, Province 1 in present days, Nepal.
1921 Reconnaissance expedition.
The first British expedition organized and financed by the newly formed Mount Everest Committee came under the leadership of Colonel Charles Howard Berry, with Harold Rayburn as mountaineering leader, and included George Mallory, Guy Bullock, and Edward Oliver Wheeler. It was primarily for mapping and reconnaissance to discover whether a route to the summit could be found from the north side. As the health of Rayburn broke down, Mallory assumed responsibility for most of the exploration to the north and east of the mountain.
He wrote to his wife, "We are about to walk off the map."
After 5 months of arduous climbing around the base of the mountain, Wheeler explored the hidden East Rongbuk Glacier and its route to the base of the North Colonel on September 23. Mallory, Bullock, and Wheeler reached the North Col at 7,020 meters, 23,030 feet, before being forced back by strong winds. To Mallory's experienced eye, the route up the North Ridge intersecting the Eni Ridge and from there to the summit looked long, but feasible for a fresher party.
1922 First attempt.
The second British expedition, under General Charles Granville Bruce and climbing leader Lt Col Edward Lylestrut, containing Mallory, returned for a full-scale attempt on the mountain. On May 22, they climbed to 8,170 meters, 26,800 feet, on the North Ridge before retreating. They were the first humans to climb above 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet, on a mountain. The scope of this accomplishment is reflected by the fact that there are only 14 mountains on Earth, the 8,000ers, that reach and exceed 8,000 meters. At that moment, Mallory and Strutt had exceeded the summit of all but 5 other mountains on the planet. A day later, George Finch and Geoffrey Bruce climbed up the North Ridge and faced to 8,320 meters, 27,300 feet, using oxygen for the first time. They climbed from the North Col to their highest camp at a phenomenal rate of 900 vrt/hr, and were the first climbers to sleep using oxygen.
1924 Mallory and Irvine.
The third British expedition was led by Brigadier General Charles Bruce. Although becoming indisposed as a result of a flare-up of malaria, he relinquished leadership of the expedition to Lt Col Edward Norton, with Mallory, was promoted to climbing leader.
Geoffrey Bruce, Howard Somervell, and John Noel returned from the previous year, along with newcomers Noel Odell and Andrew Irvine.
On June 2, Mallory and Bruce set off from the North Col, C4, to make the first summit attempt. But extreme wind and cold, exhaustion, and the refusal of the porters to carry farther led Mallory to abandon the attempt, and the next day the party returned to the North Col camp. On June 4, Norton and Somervell attempted an oxygenless summit in perfect weather. Throat trouble forced Somervell to abandon the climb at about 28,000 feet, 8,534 meters, while Norton continued correct time as visits 7th alone, reaching a height of 8,573 meters, 28,126 feet, just 275 meters, 900 feet, short of the summit. Exhausted, he turned back and rejoined Somervell for the descent. On June 8, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp, C6 at 26,900 feet, to attempt the summit, using Irvine's modified oxygen apparatus. Odell, climbing in support below, wrote in his diary that at 26,000 foot he saw Mallory and Irvine on the ridge, nearing the base of the final pyramid, climbing what he thought at the time was the very difficult second step at 12:50 p.m. It was the last time the two were seen alive. Whether either of them reached the summit remains a question that has reverberated through the decades.
Back in England, the climbing establishment pressured Odell to change his view.
After about 6 months he began to equivocate on which step it was he saw them, from the second to possibly the first. If the first, they had no chance of having reached the top; if the second, they would have had about 3 hours of oxygen each, and the summit was at least 3 hours away.
It is conceivable, though unlikely, that Mallory might have taken Irvine's remaining oxygen and attempted to reach the summit.
A much more probable scenario is that the two reached first step at about 10:30 a.m. Mallory, seeing the treacherous nature of the traverse to the second step, went it alone. He reconnoitered the base of the climbing crux and decided it was not for him that day. He returned, picked up Irvine, and the two decided to climb the first step for a look around and to photograph the complex approach to the second step. It was when climbing this small promontory that they were spotted from below by Odell, who assumed that since they were ascending, they must therefore have been on the second step, although it is now difficult to believe that the two would still be climbing from so low down at a time 5 hours late that was considered to be the turnaround hour. Descending from the first step, the two continued down when, at 2 p.m., they were hit by a severe snow squall. Roping up, Mallory, leading, may have slipped, pulling himself and Irvine down. The rope must have been caught to inflict severe rope jerk injury around Mallory's, and presumably, Irvine's, waist. Some researchers believe Irvine was able to stay high and struggle along the crest of the Yeni Ridge another 100 yards, only to succumb to cold and possible injuries from the fall. Others believe that the two became separated after the fall by the near whiteout conditions of the squall. Based on his final location, it would seem that Mallory had continued straight down in search of his partner, while Irvine, also injured, might have continued diagonally down through the yellow band. In 1979, climber Wang Hongbao of China revealed to the climbing leader of a Japanese expedition that in 1975, while taking a stroll from his bivouac, he had discovered an English dead at 8,100 m, roughly below the site of Irvine's ice axe, discovered in 1933 near the Yeni Ridge. Wang was killed in an avalanche the next day before he could provide additional details. In 1999, however, Conrad Anker of the Mallory and Irvine research expedition found Mallory's body in the predicted search area near the old Chinese bivouac. There are opposing views within the mountaineering community as to whether the duo may have reached the summit 29 years before the first successful ascent by Sir Edmund Hillary in Tenzing Norgay in 1953. Despite the existence of many theories, the success of Mallory and Irvine's summit assault must be viewed as remote at best. The leading theory amongst those supporting the summit push has Mallory overcoming the difficulty of the sheer face of the second step by standing on Irvine's shoulders. Armed with Irvine's remaining 3/4 full oxygen tank, he could conceivably have reached the summit late in the day, but this would have meant that Irvine would have had to descend by himself. However, rope jerk injuries around Mallory's waist must mean the two were roped when they fell from below the first step. 1960s Chinese Everest climber Su Jing told Eric Simonson and Johan Hemleb in 2001 that he recalled spotting a corpse somewhere in the yellow band. Despite numerous searches of the north face, no sign of Irvine has turned up so far. One researcher claims to have finally spotted Irvine's body using a microscopic examination of aerial photographs. This possible discovery set off a new round of search expeditions in 2010 and 2011. 1933, Rutledge and Houston. A major expedition, under the leadership of Hugh Rutledge, set out to climb with the great expectations that this time they would succeed. Oxygen was taken but not used because of the incorrect but lingering belief that it was of little benefit to a properly acclimated climber. After delays caused by poor weather and the illness of team members, a much higher assault camp was placed than in 1924. On the first summit attempt, Lawrence Wager and Percy Wynne Harris intended to follow the northeastern ridge, but were unable to regain it, having bypassed, rather than climb over, the first step, which they reached at 7 a.m. Direct access to the second step from the first involves a treacherous traverse. Instead of taking it, they dropped down to follow the lower, easier traverse pioneered by Norton in 1924. Observing the second step from 30.5 meters, 100 feet, below it, Wynne Harris declared it unclimbable. Shortly after crossing the Great Couloir, they turned back for poor snow conditions and the lateness of the hour. A subsequent attempt by Eric Shipton and Frank Smythe followed the same route, but Smythe, who pressed on alone when Shipton turned back because of illness, got no higher. 1934. United Kingdom Maurice Wilson, a British eccentric, stated his intention to summit Everest by himself. After only a few flying lessons, Wilson flew illegally from Britain to India, hiking through Darjeeling and into Tibet, and with the help of Sherpa guides began his attempt. Wilson was not a climber and had no climbing equipment. He expected to transport himself to the summit with spiritual help and signaled the monks at the Rongbuk monastery of his success with a shaving mirror. It is not believed he attained the North Col, 7,000 m.
Maurice Wilson's body and his diary were found wrapped in a tent in 1935 by another British expedition.
Although dumped into a crevasse below the North Col, his body has been rediscovered Ral du Het, including in 1960 by the Chinese expedition. Unlike Mallory's body, Wilson's has decayed because the temperature at the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier does rise above freezing.
1935. United Kingdom British Rod Shipton led a small reconnaissance expedition during the monsoon season in preparation for the following year's expedition.
The team climbed smaller peaks in the vicinity of Everest and examined alternative possible routes on the mountain, including the West Ridge and entry into the Western Cone via Lola. Both were dismissed as impractical, though Shipton did decide that an ascent from the Western Cone would be possible if entry from the Nepalese side could be made.
This would be the route by which the mountain would eventually be climbed in 1953.
The expedition is also notable as the first visit to Everest for Tenzing Norgay, who was engaged as one of the porters.
1936. United Kingdom Rutledge's second expedition achieved little because of a very early monsoon. 1938. The United Kingdom, after taking part in the 1935 reconnaissance expedition, the prolific British mountaineering explorer Bill Tillman was appointed leader of the 1938 Everest expedition, which attempted the ascent via the North Col but made an attempt from the west, from the main Rongbuk Glacier, as well as from the East Rongbuk. The North Col was reached from the west for the first time, and the team went on to over 27,200 feet, 8,290 meters, without supplemental oxygen before being forced down by bad weather and sickness. 1947. Flag of Canada, 1957 to 1965. SVG. In March 1947, Canadian engineers named Earl Denman, Norgay, and Ong Dawa Sherpa entered Tibet illegally to attempt the mountain. The attempt ended when a strong storm at 22,000 feet, 6,700 meters, pounded them. Denman admitted defeat, and all three turned around and safely returned. 1950. United Kingdom United States Nepal opened its borders to foreigners. Earlier expeditions had attempted the mountain from Tibet, via the north face. However, this access was closed to Western expeditions in 1950, after the Chinese took control of Tibet. In 1950, Bill Tillman and a small party which included Charles Houston, Oscar Houston, and Betsy Cowles undertook an exploratory expedition to Everest through Nepal along the route which has now become the standard approach to Everest from the south. 1951.
United Kingdom, a British expedition led by Shipton, including Edmund Hillary, Tom Bourdillon, W. H. Murray, and Mike Ward, traveled into Nepal to survey a new route via the southern face.
On September 30 at 20,000 feet, 6,100 meters on Pumori, Shipton and Hillary saw the whole of the Western Cone and concluded that ascent was possible from the top of the Cone to the west face of Lhotse, followed by a traverse to the South Colonel. They spent the next month attempting to reach the Western Cone through the Khumbu icefall, but were stopped just short of success when an insurmountable crevasse, 100 to 300 feet wide, blocked further progress near the top of the icefall. Murray wrote, "We were defeated." Denmark Klaus Becker Larsen along with two Sherpas attempted the North Col but turned back because of rockfall. He had no mountaineering experience and minimal equipment. First European to reach Nangpala. 1952. Switzerland-India Nepal. A Swiss expedition led by Edouard Weisduna attempted to climb via the South Col and the Southeast Ridge. After 5 days of effort, the team found a route through the icefall. They got past the crevasse that stymied the 1951 expedition by first descending 60 feet into it to a snow bridge and then using a precarious rope bridge to reach the other side. They were the first people to stand in the Western Cone. On May 27, for climbers, Raymond Lambert, Tenzing Norgay, René Aubert, and Leon Flory started from their tents on the South Col, two teams of Lambert/Tenzing and Aubert/Flory. Lambert/Tenzing reached Camp 7 first at 27,500 feet, 8,400 meters, followed by Aubert/Flory. The tent was too small for both teams and Aubert/Flory decided to return to the South Colonel. The team had only undergone the ascent for reconnaissance and so only one tent and a bit of food had been taken. On May 28, in unsettled weather, the final assault team of Lambert and Tenzing turned back 150 meters short of the south summit. Switzerland, India, Nepal. The Swiss attempted another expedition in the autumn of 1952 under the leadership of Gabriel Cavalli. Besides Cavalli, the team included again Lambert and Tenzing from the spring expedition, as well as 5 new climbers. In late November, the team was stopped by bad weather after reaching an altitude of 8,100 meters. Soviet Union. Several Western climbing journals reported that the Soviet Union had launched an attempt from Tibet in Octo the summit before the following year's British expedition. The alleged expedition, apparently led by Pavel Datsknolian, was said to have been a disaster, resulting in the deaths of Datsknolian and 5 other men. Both Russian and Chinese authorities have consistently denied that such an attempt took place. No physical evidence has ever been found to confirm its existence, nor is there any record of a person named Pavel Datsknolian. 1953. United Kingdom, New Zealand, India, Nepal. In 1953, a 9th British expedition, led by John Hunt and organized and financed by the Joint Himalayan Committee, returned to Nepal. Hunt planned for 3 assaults of 2 climbers each, including a third and last attempt if necessary after a delay of some days. After Wilfred Noyce and Anulu had forced a passage to the South Col, 2 climbing pairs previously selected by Hunt attempted to reach the summit. The first pair, Charles Evans and Tom Bordelon, using closed-circuit oxygen sets, achieved the first ascent of the 8,750 meters (28,700 feet) south summit, within as little as 100 meters (300 feet) of the final summit, but could go no further because of oxygen equipment problems and lack of time. 2 days later, the second assault was made with the fittest and most determined climbing pair. Using conventional open-circuit oxygen sets, the summit was eventually reached at 11:30 a.m. local time on May 29, 1953, by the New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, a Nepali, climbing the South Col route. They paused at the summit to take photographs, Hillary saying after 10 minutes of taking photographs on the summit without his oxygen set on that he was becoming rather clumsy-fingered and slow-moving. They buried a few sweets and a small cross in the snow before descending. Although they characterized it as the culmination of a team effort by the whole expedition, there was intense public speculation as to which of the pair had set foot on the summit first. In 1955, Tenzing disclosed in his autobiography that it was Hillary. News of the expedition's success reached London on the morning of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation.
Everest conquered, the New Zealander Edmund Hillary got his first mail and congratulatory telegrams from George Lowe, a fellow countryman and expedition colleague. Just 35 miles from Kathmandu, capital of Nepal, Hillary and Tenzing were welcomed and congratulated by their fellow members of the expedition.
Tenzing and I had been climbing together a good deal, and I think we've become a fairly happy pair. And this was just one example of how a pair roped together are a unit, and how one is always protecting the other. I was leading down the icefall, and when I was crossing a crevasse, a large lump of ice gave way on which I was standing, and I set off down a crevasse. Well, Tenzing, who was following, had the rope tight in a very short time, and pulled me up so I didn't go very far.
And how did Tenzing feel up there on top of the world?
He's very happy.
Times reporter James Morris sent a coded message by runner to Namche Bazaar, where a wireless transmitter was used to relay the message to London. The conquest of Everest was probably the last major news item to be delivered to the world by runners. Returning to Kathmandu a few days later, Hillary and Hunt discovered that they had been knighted for their efforts. 1954 and 1955, French and Swiss expeditions, proposed. France-Switzerland. The French had permission for a 1954 Everest expedition if the 1953 British expedition did not reach the summit, and the Swiss had permission for a 1955 or 1956 Everest expedition. 1956, Swiss expedition. Switzerland. The Swiss expedition of 1956 put the next 4 climbers on the top of Everest. The expedition made the first ascent of Lhotse, 4th highest, when Ernst Reiss and Fritz Lutzinger reached the top of Lhotse on May 18. The expedition set up Camp 6 on the South Col and Camp 7 at 8,400 meters, 27,600 feet. On May 23, Ernst Schmidt and Jörg Marmot reached the summit of Everest, followed by Dolf Riest and Hans-Ruedi von Gunten on May 24. 1960, the North Ridge. China. On May 25, a Chinese team consisting of Wang Fuzhou, Xu Yinhua, and a Tibetan, Gongbu, Kanbu, claimed to have reached the summit via the North Ridge. Owing to the lack of photographic evidence, the Chinese claim was discounted in mountaineering circles. However, subsequent research and interviews have persuaded many experts that the Chinese did indeed climb Everest from the north in 1960. 1962. United States. Woodrow Wilson Sayre and 3 colleagues made an illegal incursion into China from Nepal and reached about 7,620 meters, 25,000 feet, on the North Ridge before turning back from exhaustion. The attempt was documented in a book by Sayre entitled For Against Everest. 1963. United States. India. Nepal. First ascent by an American, Jim Whittaker, accompanied by Ngawang Gambu Sherpa, who, in 1965, became the first man to climb Everest twice, first ascent via the Hornby and Couloir on May 22 by Americans Tom Hornbyan and Willie Unsold. Hornbyan and Unsold descended by the South Col, making the ascent the first traverse of Everest. 1965. India. Nepal. On May 20, a 21-man Indian expedition, led by Lieutenant Commander M.S. Kohli, Lieutenant Commander Captain M.S. Kohli, succeeded in putting 9 men on the summit. Ngawang Gambu became the first person to reach the summit twice, firstly with an American expedition in 1963. 1969. Japan. 2 reconnaissance expeditions were undertaken in preparation for the summit expedition of 1970. Their primary objective was to scout the yet unclimbed southwestern face. On October 31, after establishing several camps on the southwestern face, a maximum elevation of 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet, was reached. 1970. Japan. On May 6, Yuichiro Miura skied from the South Col of Everest. The documentary of his feat, The Man Who Skied Down Everest, was the first sports film to win an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. See 2003 and 2008. Japan. A separate Japanese team attempted but failed to establish a new summit route along the southwest face. 6 Sherpa members of the team were killed in an avalanche, a porter was killed by a Serac icefall, and climber Kiyoshi Narita died from a heart attack. 1971. International Expedition. 1972. European Expedition. 1973. Italy. Japan. October 26, first post-monsoon ascent by Hisashi Ishiguro and Yasuo Kato. 1974. Spain. 1974 Simist Expedition. France. 1974 French Mount Everest Expedition, September, post-monsoon. 1975. Japan. On May 16, Junko Tabai of Japan became the first woman on the summit. Tabai was one of 7 Japanese climbers injured in an avalanche at Camp 2 on May 4. Tabai and her climbing partner, Sherpa Ong Charang Ai, were the 38th/39th unique individuals to complete the ascent. In 1992, Tabai became the first woman to complete the 7 summits. China. On May 27, 9 members of a Chinese team reached the summit. The team fixed a ladder at the second step, the major obstacle on the North Ridge route, which continued to be in use until 2008. Pham Thog became the first woman to ascend from the Tibetan side. In the expedition, the summit's altitude was measured as 8,848.13 meters. United Kingdom. 1975 British Mount Everest Southwest Face Expedition. On September 24, a British expedition led by Chris Bonington achieved the first ascent of the Southwest Face. Summiteers Doug Scott and Dougal Haston made the first ascent by British citizens. A band of cliffs on the southwest face, known as the Rock Band, had defeated 5 previous expeditions between 1969 and 1973. On September 20, Nick Escart and Paul Braithwaite achieved the first ascent of the Rock Band. The summit was reached by 2 teams, first on September 24 by Scott and Haston, who survived the highest ever bivouac when they were benighted on the south summit during their descent. On September 26, 4 more climbers attempted a second ascent. Peter Boardman and Serdar Pratemba Sherpa were successful, but BBC cameraman Mick Burke, climbing alone after Martin Boysen turned back, failed to return from the summit. 1976. United Kingdom British and Nepalese Army expedition to Everest, May 16. An expedition by the British Army and Royal Nepalese Army which was under the command of Tony Strother. The summiteers were Special Air Service soldiers Bronco Lane and Brummy Stokes, who ascended toward present southwest face. The United States on October 8, 1976, as part of the American bicentennial Everest expedition, Bob Cormack and Chris Chandler reached the summit via the South Col route. 1978. Italy-Austria on May 8, 1978, Reinhold Messner, Italy, and Peter Habeler, Austria, reached the summit, the first climbers to do so without the use of supplemental oxygen. They used the Southeast Ridge route. Poland October 16, 1978, Wanda Rutkiewicz became the third woman, the first Pole, and the first European woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest. 1979. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia Yugoslav West Ridge Expedition, a new route up the complete West Ridge from Lola Summit, was reached by two teams made up of Andrei Stremfolj and Nejc Saplotnik, May 13, 1979, and then 2 days later by Stipe Bozic, Stane Belic, and Ong Fu, Sherpa. Stane Belic, Ong Fu, and Stipe Bozic bivouacked at 8,400 meters. The next day, Ong Fu fell on the way down and died. West Germany German expedition, called the 1979 Swabian Expedition, death of Ray Jennett and Hannelore Schmatz. 1980, first winter ascent. Poland February 17, first winter ascent by Andrzej Zawada's team from Poland, Leszek Syci and Krzysztof Wielicki. This was also the first winter summit of any of the world's 14 8,000-meter peaks. Poland May 19, new climbing route on the south face by Poles Andrzejczak and Jerzy Kukuczka. Italy August 20, Reinhold Messner became the first to climb Everest solo and without oxygen tanks. He pioneered a new route on the North Col/face, roughly continuing Finch's climb in 1922. He traveled the northwest route for 3 days entirely alone from his base camp at 6,500 meters, 21,300 feet. Japan Takashi Ozaki and Sunio Shigehiro become the first to make a full ascent of the North Face. Basque Country, Autonomous Community, 1980 Everest Basque Expedition. First successful ascent to Everest for a Basque expedition. 1982. Soviet Union. The first acknowledged Soviet expedition climbed a new route on the southwest face to the left of the Central Gully. 11 climbers reached the summit, and the route was recognized as technically the hardest route yet climbed on Everest. United Kingdom. A small British expedition led by Bonington made the first attempt to climb the full length of the Northeast Ridge. The Chinese route gained the ridge at a high point via the North Face. The summit was not reached, and Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker disappeared while making a final attempt to climb the three pinnacles at over 8,000 m. Canada. One of the best planned, equipped, and financed attempts took place in October when the 1982 Canadian Mount Everest expedition arrived. Tragedy struck early, after the expedition's cameraman died in an icefall and 3 Sherpas died soon after in an avalanche. 6 of the Canadian team members threw in the towel. One of the remaining members, Laurie Skreslet, along with 2 Sherpas, made it to the top on October 5, becoming the first Canadian to reach the summit. 2 days later, Pat Morrow became the second Canadian to do the same. United States May 15, Marty Hoey falls to her death from the north side. Hoey was widely expected to become the first American woman to summit Everest, which did not occur for another 6 years, see September 29, 1988. Japan December 27, Everest veteran Yasuo Kato made the second winter ascent and became the first climber to summit Everest in 3 different seasons. He climbed alone from the south summit. On his descent, he and his climbing companion Toshiaki Kobayashi bivouacked below the south summit. They failed to return in bad weather. 1983. United States October 8, Lou Reichardt, Kim Mohm, and Carlos Buehler became the first to summit the east face. The next day, Dan Reed, George Lowe, and Jay Castle reached the summit. 1984.
Bulgaria April 20. Bulgarian Risto Prodanov reached the summit via the West Ridge, alone and without oxygen, and died on the way back, becoming the first Bulgarian who summited Mount Everest and the second to the summit via the West Ridge. On May 8 to 9, another 4 members, Metody Savov and Ivan Valchev, on May 8, Nikolai Petkov, and Kirill Doskov on May 9, reached the summit via the West Ridge route and descended the South Col route. India May 23, Bakendri Pal via the standard Southeast Ridge route, becoming the first Indian woman to do so. Australia October 3, first Australian ascent, without supplemental oxygen, on a new route, White Limbo, on the north face. Tim McCartney Snape and Greg Mortimer submitted. United States October 20, Phil Urschler became the first American to summit Everest's north face. 1985. Catalonia August 28, first Catalan ascent, without supplemental oxygen, along the northeast ridge by Oscar Kadiak, Antony Soares, and Carls Vyas. 1986. Switzerland Erhard Lorten and Jean Troilet climbed the north face in a single push without oxygen, ropes, or tents in 42 hours, then glissade down in under 5 hours. They climbed mostly at night and carried no backpacks above 8,000 m, a style that became known as night naked. Canada Sharon Wood becomes the first North American, Canadian, woman to summit, on May 20 with Dwayne Congdon.